What if I told you that the outcome of the entire Pacific War came down to just a few minutes where courage, luck, and precision would decide whether freedom lived or died? It was the morning of June the 4th, 1942. I stood on the flight deck of the USS Enterprise, the salty wind cutting across my face, watching our dauntless dive bombers rumble awake. Their engines growled like lions ready to be unleashed. Ahead of us, the Pacific stretched endlessly, calm, golden under the rising sun. But that calm was a lie. Within hours, these waters would become the graveyard of Japan's proudest carriers. Far beyond the horizon, Admiral Nagumo steamed toward Midway with 4 floating fortresses, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. These were the same carriers that had set Pearl Harbor ablaze just 6 months before. Their decks were crammed with aircraft, their crews brimming with confidence, certain of another easy victory. But what they didn't know was that we had broken their codes. We'd read their plans, and now they were sailing straight into an ambush. My name is Imran Tahir Dusty Kleiss. I was a dive bomber pilot with Scouting Squadron 6 aboard the Enterprise. Born in Coffeyville, Kansas in 1916, I had graduated from the Naval Academy in '38, earned my wings in 1941, and flown my share of missions in the Marshall Islands raids. By June of '42, I thought I understood war at sea. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what was about to happen, the destruction of Japan's carrier force in a matter of minutes, rewriting the fate of the Pacific at 0400 hours. The ready room aboard Enterprise was thick with cigarette smoke and tension. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McClusky Jr., our air group commander, stood at the front with a pointer in hand. A seasoned officer, Naval Academy class of 26, he had only been in command for 2 months. "Gentlemen," McClusky began, tapping the map, "the Japanese carrier force has been sighted approximately 200 miles northwest of Midway. 4 carriers, Akagi, Admiral Nagumo's flagship, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu. They're escorted by battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Our task," he paused, looking each of us in the eye, "is to sink them before they sink us. These weren't just any carriers. They were the beating heart of the Kido Butai, Japan's legendary mobile strike force. Akagi and Kaga, veterans of Pearl Harbor, were floating fortresses, each capable of unleashing more than 60 aircraft at a time. Soryu and Hiryu were newer, faster, but no less lethal. Together the 4 carried nearly 250 planes, and the finest naval aviators in the world, pilots who had been sharpening their blades in combat since the start of the war. Commander Joseph Rochefort and his cryptology team at Station Hypo had spent weeks prying open the secrets of Japan's JN-25 naval code. Thanks to them, we knew everything, the plan, the timing, even the trap Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto thought he had set for us. "Here's how it will play out," McClusky said, tapping the chart spread across the table. His voice was steady, but you could feel the weight behind it. "The Japanese will strike Midway at dawn. Once we respond, they'll attempt to draw us into their ambush. What they don't realize," he looked up, eyes narrowing, "is that we already know. Yamamoto's operation was vast, maybe too clever for its own good. A diversionary attack on the Aleutians, an invasion force sweeping up from the southwest, and Yamamoto himself holding back with the battleship Yamato 300 miles behind the carriers. But that complexity was also its weakness. It gave us room to strike first. The intelligence officer laid it out. At 0430, the Japanese launched their strike on Midway. Their fighters will be tied up, their carriers caught in the cycle of recovering and rearming aircraft. That will be their most vulnerable moment. That is when we hit them." I glanced around the room. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher of Scouting Squadron 6, a steady hand and Pearl Harbor veteran, was already jotting down notes. Beside him, Lieutenant Richard Dick Best, commanding Bombing Squadron 6, studied the weather reports. Winds out of the southeast, 5 knots, scattered clouds at 1,500 feet. For dive bombers, Conditions couldn't have been better. Some of the men were hardened by battle, others were about to face it for the first time. But we all knew the odds. The Japanese Zero could outfly anything we had. Their pilots had more combat hours than we could dream of. And on top of that, we'd be pushing our planes to their limits, 175 miles out, then back again, with barely any fuel margin for error. Torpedo 8, from the Hornet, will lead the first strike, McClusky added. Once they engage, we move in with the dive bombers. Launch is set for B-100. By 0600, the Enterprise's flight deck was alive with organized chaos. Crewmen in colored jerseys dashed between aircraft, each color a cog in the great machine of war. Red shirts heaved bombs beneath wings. Purple shirts hauled fuel hoses, filling the tanks. Brown shirts crouched low, checking gear and controls. The deck roared with life, the tension hanging as thick as the smell of fuel and grease. I walked toward my plane, SBD Dauntless Bureau number 639. Its metal skin was cool in the morning air, soon to be searing hot under enemy fire. I ran my hand along the fuselage and climbed aboard, knowing full well it might be the last time I ever set foot on Earth. My rear gunner, John Snowden, was already running his checks, fingers methodical as he inspected the twin .30 caliber guns. Snowden was from Illinois, a quiet man with the kind of calm that sticks to you in a fight. He'd saved my life once by spotting incoming Zeros before they could get a bead on us. "Morning, Snowden," I called as I hauled myself into the cockpit. "Morning, Mr. Kleiss, it's going to be hot today," he replied, not looking up. His voice was steady, the kind you learn to trust. I went through my pre-flight like a prayer. Control surfaces free and true, bomb rack locked, fuel secure. Our main tank held 230 gallons, and two 58-gallon wing tanks hugged the wings. With careful management that gave us roughly 4.5 hours aloft, just enough for the run, and maybe a prayer on the way back. The SBD Dauntless wasn't built for speed, about 255 pint top, but in a dive it was poetry, stable, precise, and as stubborn as an old mule. It could take hits that would rip lesser planes apart. I strapped in among the familiar dials and needles, altimeter, airspeed, fuel gauges, engine temp, oil pressure, each one a small, essential truth. At Aero 645, the announcement came over the loudspeaker. "Pilots, start engines." I thumbed the starter. The Wright R-1820 Cyclone coughed and roared, a living thing waking. The vibration crawled up through the airframe and into my bones. Launch order was a grim choreography. First, the Wildcats, 20 F-4F fighters, poured forward to establish combat air patrol. They tore off like wasps, quick and sharp. Next came the torpedo bombers, 14 TBD Devastators from Torpedo Squadron 6 under Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. I watched them lumber down the deck, heavy with Mark 13 torpedoes, barely clearing the ramp. They looked exposed, slow, unwieldy, heroic. Then it was our turn. Scouting, 6 under Gallagher, 18 SBDs, followed by bombing 6 under Best with 15 more. The deck blurred as each plane strained for lift, the air a mix of exhaust, sweat, and something else, anticipation, maybe fear, maybe resolve. I tightened my harness and felt the ship beneath me like a heartbeat. Ahead lay the unknown. Behind, the men who'd just become my family. I was slotted as number 2 in the 3rd Division. Commander McClusky himself would be leading the entire strike. Takeoff from a carrier deck was never routine. It was always a razor's edge between flight and disaster. The Enterprise swung into the wind, speed climbing to 30 knots. On deck, the launch officer spun his signal flag, then dropped it. I shoved the throttle forward, released the brakes, and the Dauntless leapt ahead. The island structure whipped past in a blur. The end of the deck rushed up at me. Then at 65 knots, I eased back on the stick. For a heartbeat, the plane sagged, heavy with bombs and fuel, almost too heavy. Then the wings found air, and we clawed upward. "Good takeoff, Mr. Kleiss," Snowden said over the intercom.
"Thanks, eyes sharp," I answered.
It took nearly an hour for the formation to come together. By 0806, 33 dive bombers from Enterprise had gathered, climbing in silence to 19,000 feet. We had expected to rendezvous with Hornet's group, but they never appeared. McClusky made the call, better to press on alone than burn fuel circling. We pushed northwest, the ocean rolling endlessly beneath us. At that altitude, I checked my gauges constantly, scanning the bomb site, running mental drills. In a dive, I would have maybe 10 seconds to line up, drop, and pull out. There would be no second try. At 0920, we reached the intercept point. Nothing, just open water, as empty as the sky above. My fuel gauge was sinking fast. A quick calculation told me 30 minutes, maybe less, before we'd have to turn back or ditch. The silence on the radio was suffocating. Every man up there was running the same grim math. Then at 0955, McClusky rocked his wings. I peered down and spotted it too, a lone destroyer carving a white scar across the blue, racing northeast at full tilt. It could only be heading toward the main fleet. McClusky banked to follow, gambling everything on that wake. For 20 long minutes we chased that thread of white across the sea, every tick of the fuel gauge a reminder that time was bleeding away. Then at 10:20 the ocean transformed. There they were. 4 Japanese carriers, 2 pairs, spread wide, their escorts fanning out around them. From altitude they looked like toy ships scattered on a blue carpet, but the sight tightened my chest. Planes cluttered the decks. White wakes betrayed their frantic maneuvering, and then I realized something else, unbelievable but true. There were no zeros at our height. Every last one of them had dropped low to tear into our torpedo squadrons. The sky above the carriers was wide open. McClusky's voice crackled in my headset, calm but electric. "This is McClusky, Scouting 6. Scouting 6, take the left carrier." "Bombing 6, the right," McClusky ordered. But in the chaos of the moment, confusion rippled through the formation. Both squadrons tilted their noses toward Kaga. I shoved the stick forward. My Dauntless tipped into its dive, gravity taking hold. The acceleration slammed me back, the altimeter spinning down like a runaway clock. 18,000 feet, 15,000, 12,000. The carrier below swelled in my bomb sight. Every detail snapping into focus. I saw deck crews scattering like ants, anti-aircraft guns swiveling skyward, black bursts of flak cracking around us. Still, I held steady. At 10,000 feet, the picture sharpened. Planes spotted on deck, refueling hoses snaking across the planks, bombs waiting on carts. The Japanese had been caught mid-operation, their carriers as vulnerable as they would ever be. Lieutenant Earl Gallagher dove first. His bomb smashed near Kaga's island, a fiery eruption tearing men and machines into the air.
My turn came fast.
At 2,500 feet, I pressed the release. The Dauntless lurched as the 1,000-pounder fell free.
I hauled back, 9 Gs crushing me into the seat, vision tunneling as the wings screamed under the strain.
Then daylight.
Level again, just feet above the waves, throttling away. "Direct hit!"
Snowden's voice cracked through the intercom. "Forward elevator." I banked left and glanced back. My bomb had torn into Kaga's forward deck, igniting a roaring fire. Gallagher's strike had gutted the aft section. One by one, more Dauntlesses found their mark. Within seconds, 4 direct hits turned Kaga into a floating volcano, flames consuming her from stem to stern. At the same moment, Dick Best realized the error. Pulling out early, he peeled away with 2 of his wingmen and veered toward Akagi. His bomb punched straight through the flight deck, into the hangar crammed with fueled planes and live ordnance. The explosion that followed transformed Akagi into a blazing inferno, fire racing unchecked from bow to stern. And then, timing almost too perfect, Yorktown's dive bombers swooped in at 10:22, their sights set on Soryu. In just 30 seconds, 3 1,000-pound bombs slammed home. The carrier convulsed, her insides tearing open, a fire pillar leaping 1,000 feet into the sky. 3 carriers, crippled, burning, mortally wounded, all within minutes. I looked back as we pulled clear, the ocean below a panorama of hell. Kaga was a furnace, explosions chain reacting, her forward elevator blown skyward like a chunk of steel confetti before crashing into the sea. Akagi's deck glowed red, the steel buckling under unrelenting heat. Tiny figures leapt overboard into water already slicked with burning oil. Soryu shuddered, listing hard to starboard, explosions tearing through her guts. At last she rolled, her hull glistening for a moment in the sunlight before slipping beneath the waves. In just 20 minutes, a proud warship had become a steel tomb, taking more than 700 of her crew with her. But the battle wasn't finished. We hadn't seen her yet. Hiryu, the 4th Japanese carrier, lurking 10 miles north, masked by a curtain of rain. While her sisters burned, Hiryu had slipped the net, already launching counterstrikes toward our own carriers. Zeros. 3 o'clock high. Snowden's voice cracked in my headset. His twin 30s erupted, brass shell casings clattering away as 2 enemy fighters dove straight at us. I shoved the stick forward, forcing the Dauntless into a steep dive. Speed was our only salvation. Our bird couldn't outturn a 0, but she could outdive 1. Tracers hissed past, bright threads of death in the sunlight. Then Snowden's guns went silent.
"Snowden, you okay?" I shouted. "But okay," he grunted. "I got one?" I risked a glance.
A 0 trailed smoke spiraling down into the sea, but there were more coming. I hugged the waves, duking left and right, every nerve wired tight. That's when the real battle began, not with the Japanese, but with our own fuel gauges. The needle quivered on empty, dancing cruelly at the bottom. I knew there were always a few gallons sloshing, unusable unless you nursed the plane like a newborn. I leaned the mixture until the engine coughed and sputtered, riding the edge between power and flame-out. Each mile brought us another heartbeat closer to home. Around me, the squadron staggered like wounded birds. Some trailed smoke.
Others simply gave up.
The radios filled with voices edged by despair. "Engine cutting out."
"Going in."
"Ditching, mark my position." I watched 2 Dauntlesses ahead of me nose down. One pilot managed a clean ditch, his gunner clambering onto the wing before the sea swallowed the aircraft whole. My own engine sputtered, coughed, caught again. The reserve tank had only minutes left in it, maybe less. And then, like a vision through heat haze, she appeared. The Enterprise! Rising from the horizon, her deck already swung into the wind for recovery. "Emergency fuel," I called over the radio, voice tight. "Request immediate landing. You're number 3. "Number 3. The LSO's voice cut through the radio. Ahead of me, 2 Dauntlesses clawed their way onto the deck, each landing eating up precious seconds I didn't have. My engine was coughing itself to death. As I turned into the landing pattern, the final sputter came, the cyclone quit cold. Silence, a dead stick approach.
"One chance, no do-overs." I dropped the gear. Flaps out. Aimed for the number 3 wire.
The LSO's paddles flashed. Cut, cut. I was too high. I shoved the nose down, trading altitude for speed, the prop windmilling uselessly in front of me. The deck surged upward. Wheels struck, bounced. Then the tailhook caught. Steel cables snapped me to a brutal stop. Before the propeller even spun down, deck crews were swarming.
"Get us out!" I shouted.
They dragged Snowden from the rear cockpit, his uniform soaked with blood from wounds in the shoulder and leg. But he was conscious.
He would live.
Somehow the Dauntless, peppered with over 40 holes, had brought us home.
I still don't know how. Back in the ready room, The mood was heavy despite the victory.
Of the 14 torpedo bombers from our Torpedo 6, only 4 returned. 10 crews gone. From the Hornet, the story was even grimmer. Torpedo 8 had been annihilated. 15 aircraft launched, 15 lost, 29 men killed. Only one, Ensign George Gay, survived, floating in the ocean as he watched us dive. His skipper, John Waldron, had led them in with one last message: "We will go in.
We won't turn back."
Good luck, not a single torpedo hit its mark. But their sacrifice was not in vain. By dragging the Zeros down to sea level, they had left the skies above wide open for us. When McClusky entered, his shoulder bandaged from shrapnel, he gave the tally in a ragged voice. "We got 3, Kaga, Akagi, Soryu, finished, but Hiryu's still alive, and she's hit Yorktown." The reports were grim. Yorktown had absorbed 3 bombs at noon, then 2 torpedoes hours later. Listing burning, she was abandoned. Yet her defiance had bought time to find and destroy Hiryu. That afternoon, 24 dive bombers found her. At 1700 hours, 4 bombs slammed home. Hiryu burned through the night before slipping beneath the waves. The Kido Butai, once the most powerful carrier strike force in the world, was gone. In the days that followed, we hunted the retreating enemy, sinking the cruiser Mikuma. But the greater truth was already clear. Japan had lost 4 fleet carriers, the backbone of its naval air power. Ships that had taken years to build, lost in a single afternoon. And worse than steel were the men, over 3,000 sailors and airmen gone, more than 100 veteran pilots whose skill and experience could never be replaced. At the start of the war, Japan had 6 first-line carriers.
After Midway, they had 2.
They would build more, but never again would they field the trained, battle-hardened aviators who made those decks deadly. The tide had turned. The Empire's gamble had failed. With that said, thanks for watching, and until next time. Institutional knowledge, the best-trained carrier divisions in the world, died on June the 4th. For the Americans, Midway proved that intelligence could overcome even the worst numerical disadvantage. Commander Rochefort's codebreakers gave us the enemy's plan, letting us strike from advantage instead of reacting blindly. Without that edge, we would have been late, off balance, and forced to fight on Japan's terms. The battle also exposed fatal flaws in Yamamoto's strategy. His plan was too complex, his forces scattered across thousands of miles with no ability to support each other. Radio silence kept his commanders from adjusting once the plan unraveled. And, most importantly, they underestimated us, believing the Americans would react passively and predictably. Admiral Nagumo, too, faced impossible choices. When scouts reported our carriers at 0728, his decks were in chaos, aircraft being rearmed for a second strike on Midway itself. Launch immediately with half-loaded planes, or wait and strike properly prepared. His hesitation, those 30 precious minutes, proved fatal. By the time he ordered his counterstrike, our Dauntlesses were already plunging out of the sun. That night, as Enterprise steamed southwest, I stood alone on the deck under a canopy of stars. The same stars had shone over Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. Now they watched over the wrecks of 4 Japanese carriers and the thousands entombed within them. The adrenaline was gone. What remained was exhaustion and an aching emptiness. I thought of Torpedo 8 and Torpedo 6, those crews who had flown straight into certain death. Waldron's men knew their TBD devastators were obsolete death traps against Zeros, but still they pressed on, holding course even as they were torn apart. George Gay, the lone survivor, floated alone for 30 hours in shark-infested waters, hiding under a seat cushion from Japanese patrols. He watched his friends burn, drown, and die, and carried that survivor's guilt for the rest of his life. And I thought, too, of the Japanese sailors I had helped kill. When you dive on a carrier, you see them, men scrambling across the deck, manning guns, shoving burning aircraft over the side. They are not faceless. They are young like us. Many had been flying since China in 1937. They had families, hopes, futures, all cut short in fire and steel that morning. The sea was thick with bodies. Destroyers pulled some from the water, but thousands more died, burned by oil, drowned, or taken by sharks. War is never clean, never simple, never glorious. It is young men dying far from home. Historians call Midway the turning point of the Pacific War, and rightly so. In one day, the balance of naval power shifted. Japan fell from supremacy to parity, and as America's shipyards roared to life, to inferiority. The true victory lay not only in ships sunk, but in the combination of combat power, training, equipment, and above all, the will to endure. Japan lost not just ships at Midway, but something far more irreplaceable, a generation of experienced carrier pilots. Attrition at Midway and later at Guadalcanal wiped out their elite aviators, men who could never be replaced. Japan's pilot program could train perhaps 100 carrier aviators per year. America's program, accelerated by war, soon turned out thousands. Admiral Nimitz later said the victory at Midway was won by three things: the codebreakers, who gave us the enemy's plan; the miracle of Yorktown's damage control, made battle-ready in just 72 hours when experts said it would take 3 months; and the pilots who pressed home their attacks against overwhelming odds. Each element was indispensable. Together they made Midway not just a battlefield triumph, but an industrial one. Even as we fought there, new Essex-class carriers were already under construction in American yards, ships dwarfing anything Japan could produce. In the years ahead, the United States would launch 24 Essex carriers. Japan managed 6 new carriers, most of them conversions, none able to match American power. They began the war with 6 frontline carriers and the finest aviators in the world. After Midway, they had only 2 carriers left and their veteran pilots were gone. The carefully crafted strike force that terrorized the Pacific for 6 months effectively died that June morning. I survived the war, flying 85 combat missions. At Midway, I was credited with hits on Kaga and Hiryu, and later on the cruiser Mikuma. For that, I received the Navy Cross. I retired a captain in 1962 after service in Korea, and lived to 100, passing in 2016. Among the last surviving Midway dive bomber pilots, McClusky survived his wounds. Retired a rear admiral in 1956, he never sought recognition, but his split-second decision to follow a lone destroyer changed history. His son would later describe him simply, a quiet man, not a big talker. He died in 1976, his pivotal role largely forgotten outside naval circles. George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo 8, went on to fly with TWA after the war. For decades he spoke of his squadron's sacrifice, wrote Sole Survivor, and often appeared at Navy commemorations. He died in 1994, his ashes scattered where his squadron had fallen, rejoining the men he had watched die 52 years earlier. Lieutenant Commander Dick Best, who with one perfect bomb destroyed Akagi, never flew again. He had inhaled caustic soda from a faulty oxygen canister, damaging his lungs permanently. Medically retired, he lived quietly until 2001. Many have called him the man who won Midway. Today, the Japanese carriers rest in silence, 17,000 feet beneath the Pacific. Kaga was found in 2019, upright on the seabed, her hull intact but her flight deck blasted apart. Nearby lies Akagi, showing the scars of the inferno that consumed her. They are war graves, tombs for thousands of sailors. Admiral Nagumo survived Midway, but never recovered from its shadow. Shunted to shore commands, he eventually oversaw the doomed defense of Saipan. As American forces overran the island in July 1944, he took his own life. His chief of staff, Motomi Ugaki, survived the war and later wrote extensively, defending Nagumo's impossible decisions while accepting responsibility for the failure. Mitsuo Fuchida, who had led the Pearl Harbor strike and was badly injured aboard Akagi at Midway, survived his wounds. After the war, he converted to Christianity and dedicated his life to reconciliation between Japan and the United States. It is often said that Japan lost the war at Midway in 5 minutes. Admiral Yamamoto himself was killed less than a year later, in April 1943, when American P-38s, guided by broken codes, shot down his plane over Bougainville. He had already foreseen the truth. After Midway, he reportedly told his staff, "I have killed many young men today." In 2000, Midway Atoll was designated a national memorial. Where once Marines faced impossible odds, where bombs rained down, now albatrosses nest undisturbed. A battlefield transformed into a sanctuary. Norman Kleiss' account reminds us they weren't heroes in their own eyes, just young men doing the jobs required. The real heroes were the torpedo crews who knew they would not return but flew on anyway, the codebreakers who labored in silence, the mechanics who kept worn aircraft flying, the damage control teams who saved ships from sinking, the corpsmen who saved lives against impossible odds. Midway proved that wars are not won by the best equipment or the most experienced warriors. They are won by those who adapt, who seize fleeting opportunities, who endure staggering losses and fight on. The Japanese had better planes, better pilots, and years of combat experience. But America had broken codes, radar, superior damage control, and an industrial might that could replace losses tenfold. Most importantly, America had leaders willing to take calculated risks. Nimitz risked his entire carrier force on intelligence that might have been wrong. McClusky risked fuel exhaustion chasing a lone destroyer. Richard Best risked everything by peeling off to attack a different carrier with just 2 wingmen. John Waldron led his squadron into certain death because the mission demanded it. The battle lasted 2 days, but its consequences echoed across the entire Pacific. Before Midway, Japan was advancing everywhere, seemingly unstoppable. After Midway, they never won another major offensive battle. The war would grind on for 3 more terrible years, costing hundreds of thousands of lives. But the outcome, the ultimate balance of power, was decided in those few June minutes when dive bombers caught Japan's carriers with their decks crowded by armed and fueled aircraft. Consider the fragile chain of chance and choice. What if McClusky had turned back at the empty intercept point? What if Nagumo had launched just 30 minutes earlier? What if American torpedoes had worked and Torpedo 8 had sunk a carrier instead of being annihilated? History hinges on such moments, but history deals not in what-ifs. What mattered was clear by June 1942. The tide of the Pacific War had turned. That morning, outnumbered American pilots in slower, inferior aircraft caught the world's most powerful carrier force at its most vulnerable and destroyed it. In minutes, the tide of war shifted. Intelligence, courage, sacrifice, and no small measure of luck carried the day. Today, it is hard to imagine a time when democracy itself seemed endangered, when freedom's survival was in question. But in June 1942, the fate of the free world rested on a few hundred pilots from 3 carriers in the mid-Pacific. Against logic, against overwhelming odds, they were enough. That is Midway's enduring lesson. Ordinary people, when pressed into extraordinary circumstances, can rise to meet them. Democracies, often underestimated, can produce warriors as brave and resolute as any authoritarian state. And when free men fight not for empire, but for their homes and families, they become the most powerful force on earth. The statistics remain stark. 3,057 Japanese dead, 362 Americans. 4 Japanese carriers sunk, 1 American lost. Yet numbers alone cannot capture the human cost. Each digit a young man with dreams, fears, families, lives, cut short in fire and salt water. The Pacific bears no scars of Midway. No monuments rise from its depths. Only coordinates on a chart mark where Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu slipped beneath the waves. But memory must serve where geography does not. As long as free people exist, we must remember Midway and the men who fought there. In devastating minutes, Japan's proud carrier fleet was reduced to burning wrecks. In that hour, war's course, nations' fates, and freedom's future were decided by dive bomber pilots who pressed their attacks against impossible odds. Their legacy is not just victory, but example. When tyranny rises, free people resist. Courage is not the absence of fear, but action despite it. The dead of Midway, American and Japanese alike, deserve remembrance. Young men of both nations gave their lives with bravery, whether defending freedom or fulfilling duty. They deserved better than to die so young in the lonely heart of the Pacific. Yet their sacrifice was not in vain. Freedom survived. It flourished. Where once fleets clashed, the Pacific is now peaceful, traveled by merchants, not warships. Japan and the United States, once bitter enemies, are now close allies. The war that seemed endless has been over for more than 75 years. Soon, no living voices will remain to say, "I was there."
I saw Kaga explode. I watched Akagi burn.
I dove through flak and smoke to strike the target. But the story must endure because freedom itself depends on remembering that freedom is never free. It is purchased, again and again, with the blood of those who climbed into obsolete torpedo planes, flew into certain death, dove through walls of fire, and gave everything to stop tyranny. That is what Midway achieved.
It stopped tyranny.
It saved freedom. It changed history. On a clear June morning in 1942, as the fate of the world hung in the balance, a handful of young pilots tipped the scales toward liberty.